by its decision to recognize the independence of the occupied districts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, Russia is violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and legalizing its troops in Donbas, which have been there since 2014. Now, this was stated by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in an address following a meeting of the National Security and Defense Councils. We have details in this report.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says recognizing the independence of the occupied district of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions could mean Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the Minsk agreement and ignoring decisions within the Normandy 4. Mr. Zelenskyy also says he had discussed the situation with French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, US President Joe Biden, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and European Council President Charles Michel. A phone conversation with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also planned.
Я обговорив ситуацію із президентом Франції Еммануелем Макроном, канцлером Німеччини Шольцем.
The Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin had decided to recognize the independence of the two breakaway areas of Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. A Kremlin statement said Mr. Putin had told the French and German leaders he intended to sign a decree recognizing the areas as independent states. Russian President Vladimir Putin said he would recognize the rebel-held self-declared republics in eastern Ukraine in an address on Monday.
Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
Meanwhile, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, says he is greatly concerned by Russia's decision on the status of the certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine and called for a peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in accordance with the Minsk agreement, according to a spokesperson. In a statement issued on Monday, UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said the Secretary General considers Russia's decision to be, quote, a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
The Secretary General is greatly concerned by the decision by the Russian Federation related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. He calls for the peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in accordance with the Minsk Agreement, as endorsed by the Security Council in 2015. The Secretary General considers the decision of the Russian Federation to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
In another twist, Russia has continued to receive more than 80,000 refugees from Donbas since 17th February. More than 11,000 refugees, including 4,888 children, were sent from the Rostov region, were sent to temporary accommodations in 11 other Russian regions on Tuesday, according to the regional government. Humanitarian assistance to the refugees is also being collected throughout Russia.
For more on the heat coming from the Russia-Ukrainian territorial tension, international affairs analyst Demola Abbas joins me virtually in Lagos. Good to have you join us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So in the past 24 to 48 hours, we've seen President Putin make really critical decisions. One of them is to recognize breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine. Another is to send troops into those regions where he says they are there for peacekeeping. Is this a violation of the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine? And could this become a pretext for war?
Well, thank you very much for your questions. They're very, very vital questions. Well, number one, there is no doubt that recognition of the breakaway regions within Ukraine is a violation of the UN Charter. And that is because if you look at Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the UN Charter, it talks about matters that happen essentially within the internal or the domestic affairs of a member state. Whatever is happening in Ukraine today is within Ukraine as a nation. So Russia acting in that way is actually an intrusion or interference in matters that are considered essentially as matters within the territorial integrity of a member state of the United Nations, which, of course, Ukraine is. So there's no doubt that that is a violation. And, of course, the second question is whether it can be a pretext. There's no question that that can actually become a pretext for Russia to invade, to do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a country itself. I mean, well, what it has done so far is to recognize two, separate regions, and that is talking about Donetsk and Luhansk. But the point is that could become a pretext because the end game is for Russia eventually to probably mobilize its troops to be able to go effectively into Ukraine. So you can call this, what has happened now, as just Russia taking the pulse of the international community to gauge precisely how the West, led by the US and European Union and NATO, are going to respond to this. So it could be a pretext.
Let's talk about the response so far. We've seen sanctions in response to this move by Russia, and the U.S. also has signed. The U.S. president signed an executive order forbidding or prohibiting rather companies in the U.S. or individuals from investing in those regions. What's your thoughts on the scale of response so far?
Look. Again, that's a very important question. We have to be mindful of the functions of sanctions here. The sanctions imposed in response to what Russia has done, which is recognizing, these two breakaway factions in the eastern region of Ukraine. How far can they go in hurting Russia? How far can they go in achieving the kind of goals or the objectives that the international community wants to see in Russia and that in Ukraine, beg your pardon? That is Russia de-escalating completely, withdrawing from the frontiers or the borders of Ukraine, and allowing Ukraine its own quantum of sovereignty to be able to do whatever it wants to do. The sanctions are much limited. Let's forget, they're not this kind of sanction that Putin, beg your pardon, President Biden has been looking forward to imposing if there is a full-scale invasion. What the US has said so far is the fact that what has happened, the recognition of those two regions, does not actually meet the bar that is being set by the US to impose the crippling or the severe sanctions that the Biden administration has promised. But look, at the end of the day, you have to look at it as a whole. What actually will be the effect that sanctions will provide for the US and the rest of the international community in moving or in trying to bring Russia to behave, to come within the Committee of Civilized Nations in its behavior? Sanctions have been imposed over and over. I don't think that is deterrent enough for Russia at the moment as a country. But again, that leads us to the question: if no sanctions, then what can be done? US has made it clear there will be no American boots in Ukraine. But the question is whether
and that's what I was going to ask you. And sorry to jump in. What exactly can be done? Because that brings to mind the statement made by the Ukrainian president, where he said that clear and effective. I just want to state it where he said it. He said clear and effective actions of support from Ukraine's international allies are important at this time. What exactly should be the clear and effective actions?
That's a very important question, Precious. Look, what Zelenskyy, that's the president of Ukraine, was actually hoping for a few days ago, during the German conference, his conference in Germany, was for the US and the rest of the international community to move swiftly and impose sanctions before Russia had acted. And the question is, how would that be done? Sanctions are supposed to be deterrents. They are not supposed to be provocative. If you impose sanctions before Russia has moved, then Russia could see where you've played your game. What is limiting me? So you don't play at that point in time. The second question is, will Zelenskyy or Ukraine allies be looking towards deployment of NATO troops? Now, NATO, Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, no. And the hope, what Ukraine is pushing for in Belarus was to become, and is still to become, a member of NATO. It hasn't achieved that. That has been frozen for the past 13 years. When the North Atlantic Treaty was established in 1949, it wasn't a contemplation that some of these states will be. And this goes to the crux of this matter. Precious, we have to be clear about this.
I think we lost connection there with Professor Ademola Abbas, but he made a really good point. about what's going on there in Russia, in the Russia-Ukrainian border. Thank you so much, Professor Abbas, for your points.